So, I'm not sure if this is gonna be, timed right, just because I'm not exactly 100% on the streaming system yet, but I'm getting better at it. So right now I am working on just making the system as smooth as possible. I'm pretty sure there's like 30 seconds of dead time ahead of this thing, but we'll see how this works out. Right now I'm setting my phone to do not disturb and just getting ready for this thing. So I'm kind of just doing these as a sort of video journal at this point. Not really anticipating too much attention. I don't really want too much attention. There's a lot I just want to get out there with regards to these topics, right? So the first thing I want to talk about is the idea of jihad, which I'm sure most people have a context for it, at least in the English-speaking world, of meaning holy war, terrorist shit, and that's kind of one of the gross oversimplifications of kind of a very important principle. Just because, for better or worse, a jihad is very much a spiritual process of struggle, of trying to triumph over one's lower self, and it's the sort of thing that is simultaneously looked down upon but also revered in our Western culture, ideas, whatever. But the problem comes when just the idea of having a spiritual struggle is made out to be a mental illness, made out to be something of a character failing, not being adjusted to a consumerist society. So with that in mind, people have to choose how they present themselves within a culture like this, where if one is going through what I guess some would call an awakening experience, right? Do they go to their psychiatrist to talk about it? Do they confront the issue with family members? Do they share? No, usually they just go away, disappear into some corner, if possible, to a friend's trap house, a cave, a dungeon somewhere. And as I look at the recent history, particularly of who gets villainized, right? Once you have the context of the word jihad, you automatically think of people like Bin Laden, of the Ayatollahs, the Iranian Ayatollahs, outside of the Muslim world, then come to the idea of supervillains. And the modern day supervillain is somebody like Jeff Bezos, someone like Bill Gates, what do you call him? Who else? Elon Musk is kind of approaching it recently, but he's got a bit of goodwill. But, people still are very skeptical of what his motives are. But the commonality is always, like, people in positions of power. People waging some sort of combat by way of excessive wealth. Because, the Bin Laden family is one of the richest families in the world today. Bin Laden's position in the leadership of Al-Qaeda was not by virtue of his leadership skills, but much more so a virtue of his access to resources, his ability to raise funds, the ability to, feed the movement. in many ways, and that's part of why he gets recruited and trained with CIA resources from a very young age. In his 20s, he's a person of access and reach. And then this idea has been consistently stuck with me, right? You either die a hero or live long enough to become a villain. And that's very much the classic truth of the people that I've mentioned. Jeff Bezos's, the the Gateses, the people like essentially leaders of industry that start becoming eccentric with their behaviors. And by eccentric, I mean not necessarily, building death lasers or something like that, but having access and privilege, but rather than going the standard philanthropic route of trying to immediately, feed or clothe and shelter everyone, decide to reinvest their funds into something like a space program or, strange research projects or, investing in new technology. Richard Branson is one, but there's a very much a big central focus on space programs, especially in my own work. But what comes from this is this consistent idea of why is it that once people start looking to the stars, they get demonized by the people on Earth, right? And there was a time when, this may just be like rosy-colored glasses or whatever, but there was a time where people pushing the limits of understanding of access, of reach, were, celebrated within our culture, right? And there's been this consistent anti-capitalistic sentiment that's been brewing as wealth inequality has increased, while simultaneously there's been a consistent reduction in not just birth rates, but also comfort with spirituality, not just in a religious sense, but also in the deeply psychological bent of it, beyond something like how do you describe these people? Hippies, right? Because there's an increased acceptance of the hippy-dippy subcultures, right? But at the same time, there's still a rejection of this idea of people, going out, doing acid, shrooms, whatever, dancing in the moonlight, absorbing into pagan ideas and cultures, and coming out of it transformed for the better. Generally, the idea is that they're non-productive members of society, mooching off whatever land they're able to find. We have this idea of the share culture and all this stuff, and people like Elon Musk are very much a part of this. They're supportive of it. They have floats for Burning Man and all this stuff. But there's a sort of surfaceness to it that we don't want to admit to, because what use is there in having no real depth to it, right? Because you can say, I found myself, I've taken the ayahuasca brew and discovered new things about me and met the spirit of the earth or of the plant or whatever entheogen I have taken, right? But with that, there's still I guess in Hindu culture and Buddhist tradition, they're called sadhis, right? Sort of these, let's just call them spiritual powers, right? They're, ESP, psychic abilities, teleportation, the limits and beginnings of technologies and abilities that seem beyond the pale of available technology and our current understanding of physics. And this is part of the issue with this psychedelic / spiritual revolution that happens. Because as more and more people start tuning into this, they lose their attachment to the modern mind space. You know, it's just part of the process. So, you know, being comfortable as a society with people effectively not just dropping out but dropping in, and then realizing their full potential as, you know, non-corporeal beings in corporeal shells, and then exercising a level of influence over society creates problems for any ruling class, just because you're a ruling class. But the very things that made the previous ruling class capable of attaining their position is negated by the qualities needed to attain this next level, you know. Being able, like, one of the classic tropes is like, we're all one man, the love everyone, the sort of peace and happiness and joy very much goes against the classic idea of consumerist, capitalistic, me before we mindset, you know. So the game becomes like, how do you maintain profits in an economy where people don't care about consumerism to the same extent? What do you charge them for? And, you know, part of it, you start seeing an adaptation to this in the way we get sold meditation aids and guided meditations and all this stuff. But even that is it's an introductory, sure, surface level thing that helps us cope with the increased stress of the modern day. But we do lose a lot in having another voice, essentially filling up the emptiness that should be our own voice when you go into a meditative state. Because, monks in a, in a monastery aren't meditating to a lead guru talking to them constantly. And having that become the norm very much loses a large amount of what is possible with this sort of exercise. And this sort of, meditative technique is definitely pushed by the corporate class just because it improves productivity, decreases, anxiety levels, helps with focus, but too much and people realize, wait, my priorities are on backwards, my life isn't comfortable, I'm not happy, I'm not doing well, my work is corrupting to society. So there's definitely a benefit to having people comfortable to an extent, but not so comfortable, not so aware that they're able to reject the very cultural norms and mores that put them in the position that they're at, right? So why do we get villains out of this, right? Why is it that as the culture consistently, produces people that go through these spiritual crises, that then decide to do things on their own, and then once they do something on their own and have people join them, and the movement grows exponentially, the people are inevitably demonized from becoming heroes. Like Osama bin Laden was a freedom fighter before he became the greatest threat to the American regime, right? Or Jeff Bezos was a hero to the little guy, and made books, like an online bookstore that became the greatest retail company in history. And granted, the practices of the business, because it has to keep a profit, really suffered in terms of the moral quality of what was happening, because to meet shareholder demands you have to fleece your employees. So there's this interfacing issue that happens once you start acquiring influence and power, that it's this, it's a classic idea of absolute power corrupting absolutely. But there's a practical level to it too, where it's not just that they're acquiring power, it's the interface with society itself in the way it is to make the systems that they're creating more adapted to survive, right? So you have this issue now where, like, with Al Qaeda, for instance, they started off. I know I've read and heard the history of them repeatedly, but I'll try to shorten it as much as possible. So the Russians and the Americans are having, the ideological war of capitalism versus communism, right? The Russians are trying to move into Afghan turf to help create a buffer against NATO forces, and it's just their standard expansionist, imperialistic mindset. If we seize territory around us, we're safer from missiles, while also, they didn't really need Afghan oil, but it definitely was a plus. And then there's a whole range of, ancient technologies and all sorts of things associated with these old lands. The Sumerian culture was there. Their whole hosts of things like Stargate tech and all this. Ancient caves that lead deep underground. So there's a lot to profit from just having access to that, right? So the Mujahideen were sort of pushed as a rebel force that could help against the Russian advance, guerrilla warfare tactics. They get trained in, I believe it was Iran, which, explains why bin Laden later would move back to Iran, because that's where he spent what were effectively his college years. So they get well educated. They're already charismatic people, and once they start executing their missions, with Elon Musk, it was fixing payment systems. With Bezos, it was, making it easier to distribute goods. It's just simple things that on the surface would help society at large, right? But then as those systems grow beneath them, around them, they need to be fed. And like all demons that need feeding, they eat and eat and eat. They don't want to kill their beast because they're the ones that created it. They're monsters bigger than themselves at this point. And the thing is that you start seeing things around you that can also be consumed with, who's another big villain? Zuckerberg, right? So, instead of innovating in the typical way, you consume other companies, and within the companies you hire people to innovate within a limited scope, right? And this is where the demonization and the sort of, I guess the best word for it would be emasculation of the culture starts to take hold. Because there's no acceptable way for somebody to work within a system like that and build themselves up without having to submit to higher forces, what do you call these people? Board members. There's much more to this than just the financial level of it, too, because there's a whole governmental infrastructure that comes above them to regulate their work, to control the flow of information through their services, right? So we have things like the PRISM project, which was the state essentially saying we want to be able to see and access the information that flows through your networks. This is in the case of Zuckerberg and Amazon services and big tech companies like that, right? And in order to be able to continue to operate, they have to comply because they've set up systems that are dependent on state infrastructure to continue operating. And because they've set up systems that now have to keep a profit, there's nothing they can do but to comply. to keep the profitable system, because otherwise they fall into debt, the whole system collapses on itself. The mindset of somebody in a position of power within the system is to keep the prestige. It's its own addictive drug, like being in power within sort of this structure, right? And these people aren't trained in anti-addictive practices. It's not something you learn unless you're looking to learn it. You're just trained to do the thing that makes the most money, do the thing that increases the most access and profit, and it creates a series of, let's say, human vectors that make you easily manipulated. You can be messed with through romance, through your family, through the whole host of properties and whatever you've worked to acquire over the lifetime of your company. So now, how does one exist within this system as a regular consumer? You use the services available to you that improve your life the most. In the case of Facebook, you have access to more people and friends. In the case of Tesla, PayPal, they make it easier to pay for things. You have reduced power consumption. You feel like you're doing more for the environment by buying an electrical car, for instance. Yes. But at the same time, these organizations are funded by the government at large. And I'm not saying big shadow government stuff. This is wide public knowledge. The main reason Tesla's profitable is because they get massive subsidies, the way Chinese electric car companies do, to help create carbon offsets and things like that. Ditto Amazon, right? You've got government contracts that become the bulk. I don't want to say the bulk, but enough of a share of their profits to keep them compliant. Because why would you want to lose the big cushy government contract? It's not like the oversight is good enough for them to not skim off more than you'd expect them to. So profit margins become dependent on not rocking the boat, not being too revolutionary, not innovating in ways that disrupt the system at large. And it creates a weakness in the system, because with Facebook, for instance, right, they had I remember when in the earlier days, let's say 5 years ago, 5, 6, 7 years ago, right, I was learning programming on GraphQL, GraphPL, I believe, is the Facebook graphical programming system. And you could manipulate let's not say manipulate, you could navigate social networks, find out information about people, just if you knew the right way to, navigate the nodes and edges of people's social networks. And with those connections, you could see, okay, this person's likely to be into this or that, whatever. And on a level, this is the sort of ideal surveillance system that we always wanted as a state since the days of communism, or the communist Red Scare, right? Because once you have a good estimation of what's in the minds of the people, what their interests are, you can then point them one way or the other. And this is where the true dastardliness of what's happening starts to dawn on us, because it's much more than just advertising to understand you. It's a cultivation of minds, of your growing souls, people's lives. There's this idea, right, of us being meat bags, but the flavor of what controls that meat bag is important. And part of the Facebook algorithm and part of the YouTube algorithm, for instance, is just feeding us back what we want, what we're interested in. But the problem with that is that it's already known that we're triggering dopamine receptors, we're triggering feedback loops of anxiety and cortisol. And if you're then using that to be the determining factor of what people get fed in terms of information from a network. You're programming them to seek out information that disrupts their mind state consistently. And the disruption becomes the norm, the agitation, the anxiety. And then you feed back into this need for profit, the need for continual expansion, behaviors that increase this net anxiety also correlate to, I guess the phrasing is like lower mental states, which is in direct opposition to the systems that would improve, productivity, mindfulness, reach, conscientiousness of a people. And to create a balancing force, people do reject the system, and they end up dropping off of these websites. They end up, leaving, going into the woods, just not being engaged in the system. But that's where they lose the selective advantage of just access to information. So the game becomes, how do you exist within a system that is not working towards your best interest? Because if your best interest is a state of constant anxiety, a worry, a fear, the stress involved literally shortens your life. But then you compile this with a series of chemical experiments that have started since, let's say, the 1940s with the atomic experiments, right? We were trying to figure out how radiation changes gene expression. Cancers, the whole shebang. But then from there we get artificial plastics and polymers that would go on to produce, the plastic water bottles we have today, the shoes, our feet. Like, one of the big advantages to American productivity in the 40s was our ability to produce these artificial polymers. And, the earliest of these from the Dow Chemical Company were the plastics that would be based on, artificial estrogens. Because this is just before the release of, birth control systems like, the modern birth control pill. But they couldn't quite get estrogen molecules right, but they did find that the estrogen molecules would be able to polymerize well. So that's how we got, the standard systems of plastics that we have now. But even as a base, any basic, let's say mid-grade science student in a college course would be able to tell you that yes, a monomer of a polymer would be able to still have an effect to a lesser degree, even if it doesn't fit just right into the receptor. And that's what we see with a lot of the chemistry involved in modern day life, right? The issue with BPA plastics, the issues with just the continual poisoning of the American populace. So you've got radiation poisoning, you've got chemical poisoning, and then you've got psychological poisoning. And by psychological poisoning, I mean a continual agitation to drive anticipatory ratings, You need something to constantly fill the noise and void of existence to continue to exist. Even our conception of how we meditate becoming based on relaxation documents and sort of the feedback loop of continuous voices telling us how to think and how to calm ourselves in particular, and what to calm ourselves with. And sure, these can be training wheels to greater depth, but the issue is there's very little guidance to the higher levels of what's possible, just because, one, it's not profitable, because nobody that really gets into this wants to be public about it, just because that it defeats the purpose of, sitting alone and quiet and contemplating reality and working out the way things work within yourself. Which comes to the issue of, I guess the topic would be soul capture. What types of souls, what types of minds are more easily computed and used for a system? And the simple answer to that is just the simplest ones. The ones most easily driven by base demands in life, base concerns, but the ones that are most easily understood as well. If you work your 9-to-5 job, you live your existence within a set loop of, the weekly culture. Your predictability makes it easy to create a simulation of your existence. Your reality requires minimal bandwidth to generate on a computational scale, just because the repetition is easily understood and set up. And part of this system, right? So one of the things I've done with this, I guess you'd call it the background this week, has been this, just a little bit of trying to translate what's happening in a loop of thought, the constant cycling of ideas, and pairing that with this idea of a flow of time. So you could see the loop as, a 3D space, but you're constantly falling in a 4D dimension, or in the third, fourth, whatever dimension. So this is a flattening of 3D space into 2 dimensions that you're existing in, but in order for time to progress, you have to move forward to this arrow of time. And that's where this idea of time crystals becomes very easy to understand, because within the human life, if your life becomes that, I guess, regular in terms of what you're doing, how you're thinking, what you're creating, humans become time crystals in and of themselves, just because of the regularity, the monotony, the routine of it. And one of the interesting concepts I've been dealing with has been this idea of trying to prove or disprove what dark matter is. And one of the common theories has been this idea of dark matter being the weight of consciousness on space-time. The effect of having constant observation reducing the rate of things like quantum teleportation, movement in and out of our common understanding of space-time, just because we're constantly collapsing wave functions of objects around us. So they're more set in stone, and that creates a weight and influences mass and makes things seem and feel heavier. But not things themselves, but the space-time itself. So it's less likely for things to randomly pop into existence if there's already a conception of what it is. And this is one of those, stretchy Clark Tech woo-woo things, just because it's very far outside of standard human conception. But the reason it is because the culture had been, let's say, demystified since the ages of Rome, right? The constant trudge towards rational thinking, though it's created a great deal of advancement in terms of hard science, tech, the use of mathematics to expand and understand our world, also creates a dearth in terms of how we understand the complexities of chaos, because there's a limit to what math can do. Or I don't want to say math because of it's the finite maths, where you deal with limitations of understanding. So this is where we get into this idea of fractal reality, where the increased depth of something also increases the amount of information you can get there. So there's a point where quantifying what you see is relevant to just describing the pattern of it, which is something like with something like the Mandelbrot set, for instance, the 2-inch equation that you run iteratively over itself to generate something of infinite complexity, and having that be an understanding of the basis of reality in 11 to 17 dimensions. I'll get into dimensionality later, but just run with me on this one. So you have a process that runs iteratively in time, creating branching realities of ridiculous complexity. Like, mathematics can't do it justice because you have to be working within infinities of possibilities just to be able to grasp what's happening, which is kind of the issue of working with souls as a currency, as a tool, just because you're working with systems of infinite complexity. That's the problem with souls, right? It's because they're infinitely complex, you have to corral them into systems that make them easy to understand, and that forces a continual regulation of the culture. And that's something we saw post World War II, and that's part of this issue with how we manipulate the culture to be suitable for space travel, because you need to have a concept of what's right and proper, but in addition, a flattening of the culture makes it easier for those in the know of what you'd say is the higher level of consciousness to be able to warp into the minds of others, because they know how they think, because their thinking has been standardized and regulated. It's easy to create factory workers. It's easy to understand your average office persona. This idea of not creating a culture of thinkers also makes for an easy to, let's say, less analyze, not just manipulate, but just guided culture. But then how do you want to guide them? So the two issues here: what is right for humanity, or what's best for humanity, versus what's best for non-humanity. And this is where we get into this idea of the modern day conceptions of right and wrong, and why the people that we see as heroes become villains. Because once you get liberated from this common morality of the mass, and you can see the puppet strings at work over the common thought process, while you compile that with people with access and privilege and power, there's it's displayed easily enough in movies like The Matrix and They See and things like that, or They Live rather, where people start breaking into realms that they're not supposed to be in. They start piecing together things that they're not supposed to see. They start breaking the system that created them, but not breaking them to start violence or warfare or anything like that. It's more breaking them to liberate themselves and others to be free, right? And the issue with having a free public is that it's the chaos of so many minds being so diverse, right? That's one of the issues that we have today. There's very little diversity of thought, because the standardized... it helps have a society that thinks the same way. That's one of the issues that I've had with Islam and just religion in general. Just the the control, the lack of originality, the lack of imagination that we see. But they weren't always like this, right? Every religion had a point in their, exponential growth phase that encouraged creativity, right? We have great Christian art all the way through the Renaissance period, right? Before the Renaissance, it was the monks that held and maintained culture. They weren't just copying down Bibles. They were copying down Arabic texts, and those Arabic texts, became what we have today, and the Arabs copied that knowledge from the Greeks through the transfer of knowledge back and forth. And again, the collapse that we see in the diversity of thought butts against the issue of systemized ways of spreading information across, the world. So one of the big effects that we saw, let's say, in the 90s was an increased diversification of subcultures. That was kind of why the 90s were sort of let's say, a golden age of creativity in its own way. It started seeing, prior to the 80s, you had the MTV culture. TV was a big regulating force on the group mind, and then the internet became a secondary layer on top of that, helping to standardize the thinking of the masses as subcultures started to emerge, right? And again, in the 60s, part of the reason we had the psychedelic revolution was because of MK Ultra experiments that were, one, accidentally, literally accidentally opening up the minds of people, because they're still experimenting with the technology at this point in time. And with this comes the issue, right? They're trying to unseal, and I hate using the word they, just because it's a big woo-woo thing, but you can go through the documents and start tracking down. Well, the CIA database is really open for anybody to look into, but you can see a continual pattern of people trying to quantify and manipulate the mindsets of people in large group gatherings, in settings with, especially in Ivy League institutions, you're trying to control the minds of the people that will be controlling the minds of others. And you've got to limit their scope of thinking to a range that's appropriate for the powers that be. And with that comes a responsibility of what is acceptable and unacceptable thought, and being able to dictate that to, a young, impressionable mind. So where do you go from there, right? You're an 18, 19-year-old, you're not supposed to be thinking about certain things instinctually, because, every time you've butted up against something like psychics or something like that, it's always shut down as being woo-woo, strange. You don't want to be thrown in an insane asylum, but at the same time, the ideas are compelling enough that you want to try it. So you get this increase in things like the witchy subculture that we have now. And with that, you've got to pollute the waters, right? The idea of being a witch has to be commodified in a way that invalidates its effectiveness. Because, yes, you can have the witchy subculture, but you can't have them be effective. And you can have the, psychonaut subculture, but they can't be effective. That's the point. They're corrals for thinking. They're corrals for willpower. They're corrals for the ingenuity that would be inherent to, people exploring this sorts of information. And breaking free of these constraints makes you a villain inherently, just because the powers that be, and it's a shitty word as well, because it's not somebody like an Elon Musk, it's not a Jeff Bezos, it's not a Mark Zuckerberg. These are largely figureheads to larger market forces. The powers that be are the people to an extent, but they're also those that have minds that have transcended the limits of common thought. And, you can go into this idea of alien overlords and all that fun, deep, woo-woo stuff, but the general idea is of overminds that can influence minds in subtler means and, via just basic electronic, communication. So one of the things I do with these patterns, right, is to help cancel out the inherent patterns that are released from your screens. And part of this is it's an old DoD, Department of Defense patent where they tried to see if they could influence the thinking of people through the pattern of lights shining in on people's skins, on people's eyeballs, to influence mood, keep them on a specific wavelength, just because the way the neurons fire, right? Multiple times per second in a very fixed rate. Like the TV screens are at 60 hertz, something like that. And just keeping... So back in the day, they were originally at 24 hertz, just to keep the frame rate obvious enough to help movement and keep the continuity of motion in a moving picture, right? But in playing with these rates, you can play with mood, you can play with thinking patterns, you can play with just the range of ideas that comes from the mind in very subtle ways. It's not like you're trying to implant a particular idea in a particular individual. This is a statistical game being played over the entire population. So instead of saying no more scientists or no more, Nikola Teslas, you reduce curiosity in ways that buck the common trend of thinking, right? Like someone like Nikola Tesla, right? His mother, I believe, was an engineer, and his father was a priest. And that sort of bent creates a mind that's capable of dealing with the duality of spirituality and science in a very concrete way. Consistent meditation, prayer, that sort of thinking, but silent coexistence with your own thinking, while working out, mathematical systems, electrical systems, things like that. While at the same time you have a condition where he's increasing his body's native bioelectricity. And, the body's a whole bioelectric system. And if the mind is, a non-corporeal phenomena, and you're increasing the energy available to it, you create a system within yourself that inevitably expands and reaches out and influences the bioelectricity of those around you. And that's where the issue comes if you're doing this on a scale of the entire population. Because, a whole population like this self-organizes into ways that are not controllable. Because if the average, let's say, voltage of the individual starts to approach that of those of a mind that is, trying to manipulate the system above them, it's not worth it to exercise that level of influence over them. The available bandwidth becomes so high and costly just to keep that many minds on a, let's say, treadmill system to, extract not just, labor from them, but also psychological force. Because now, with this idea of minds exerting mass and influence over reality by forcing a collapse of wave functions, by controlling where the focus is, you control where the collapsing is happening. But also, you can divert that to do things like manipulating space-time, like literal, tangible effects in terms of the very solidity of different aspects of our reality, right? Like, if you have people tuning out of the system because of frustration, of exhaustion, or of boredom, the loss and influence, and I'm not talking about just things like advertising, I'm talking about things like the idea of a psychic war becomes a kind of a misnomer for what's happening, but it's the best analogy I can come up with at this point, because the issue isn't that people are dying, which they are, but the issue is more about how they're reincarnating, right? And who's reincarnating where and to what ends, and whether the quality of reincarnation is better or worse than those before them, right? If people are... So there's this consistent idea within Buddhist theology of escaping the cycles of reincarnation to elevate to a higher plane of existence and all that stuff. And the idea is that these higher planes are more ethereal or higher dimensional, for instance, would be a good point. But there's a... Let's say if the speed of light is a limiting force, it's a consistent fact throughout reality, and you have light moving in higher and higher dimensions, the amplitude of the light within, like, let's say a three-dimensional vector versus a five-dimensional vector, the available amplitude to act within that increased dimension or increased dimensionality is reduced, just because you're now dividing that speed of light across 4 or 5 spaces rather than the 1 or 2 or 3 in our case, right? Like, you can only go so far at X and Y and Z to create it's a Pythagorean theorem, right? It's A squared plus B squared equals C squared, but C squared only, and C being the speed of light, right? So if there's a maximum on C, like, C is always going to be 1, and you have to split that 1 across more and more dimensions. A squared plus B squared plus, let's say, D squared equals C, speed of light. But then A, B, D, E, 4 dimensions, equals C. C is consistent. And then the smaller components of that speed of light get reduced consistently across these dimensions. Now, you're relating now a 3-dimensional body with a higher dimensional energy source, or higher dimensional... I don't want to say energy source, because where the energy source? With a higher dimensional existence. They're less dense, less ethereal, and must influence our reality in subtler and subtler means, just because the energy density in the lower dimensions is higher, just by nature of being in a lower dimension. And in order to influence things, you can't just push... It's the issue of a ghost existing in our reality, right? A ghost can't push an object unless it's able to focus on it intensely. And we start seeing this sort of thing happening in the way, mindsets are, influenced in our reality. Instead of, exerting a direct will upon the people saying, hey, we are here, we're doing this, we're doing that. The people can rebel, obviously, they can, work to steal technology. There's a whole range of issues that comes along if you can't directly influence and exert physical force in the way that we can in our 3D plane. So this becomes part of the reason why souls have to be manipulated and captured and harvested, right? Because if you're now a 5D creature and you're trying to manipulate what's happening on a 3D realm, you have to then influence the minds, you have to reproduce minds that act in concert with your will. And the issue becomes how many minds are compatible in what ways. And what happens is, because of, let's say, squash time perspectives, squash space perspectives, different species have already gone through this, and let's just say been conquered by these sorts of ghosts, so to speak, right? The conceptual beings, rather. So different moral systems can be viewed in this sort of way, different ideologies. This idea of what's real being more than just the physical reality, but conceptual reality. Like, is the number 1 or 2 or 3 real? Is it more real than, let's say, a color, pen, or a book? Like, the idea of a color is something that we've created to explain a phenomenon around us. The color is not objectively real, it's culturally real. Like, there's this idea that colors didn't have names until we gave them names, right? Green, black, white, blue. Those are creations of our culture. But equanimity, the idea of justice, liberation, freedom, are these concepts that exist outside of human thought? Are they, parts of reality itself? And that becomes an issue of, the freedom of thought, of what happens when you have complex self-organizing systems and subsets within that system choose. Then we have the issue of the freedom of choice. Is choice real? But act in ways that go against the established pattern of the system that they're in. So this is one of the issues with a fractal reality, where the complexity of action in a sort of self-encompassed system, like, makes a mess of it. Like, it's rough. There's a limit to how much information you can get within the system before you fill up your capacity, which is one of the issues of capturing souls, right? There's a limit to the complexity of, understanding of what they've created, of what the mind is. So there's a continual deterioration of trying to transfer and create and mold minds to fit a certain, let's say, vessel. So, and like, I'm trying to wrap concepts that I'm not even sure where to begin with in terms of passing the information along, because you can describe a soul as a complex waveform, but now this is not just complex in terms of complicated, but the complex plane, or a wave that is not just amplitude and frequency, but also rotation of, so this is a higher dimension added to just the up and down. You have twists and turns, but then you have that waveform being translated through a tree system within the mind of microtubules that reverberates within itself and creates a pattern, sort of like an instrumental ring, so to speak, within a consciousness. And the problem that happens when you're trying to capture this sort of waveform is that there's a limit to, how do I say, the informational depth. You can only get so far in the roughness of this pattern before you've lost the total complexity of the information. And one of the issues that comes about in this is, you're trying to translate, it's a music loss, a lossless compression of sound. And it works in certain mediums, but not in others. So if you're trying to translate, let's say, a vinyl disc to a CD, you've got to you've got to essentially play the vinyl out, but that playing automatically disrupts the recording a little bit, so there's distortion. And if you keep feeding the pattern back and forth over and over again, the distortion compounds on itself. And that's what we see happening with our reality, but also with the collection of minds and souls. And this is already getting a bit like topsy-turvy, because you got one level where you're trying to cultivate the types of souls, the types of thinking, to make them more compatible to a system that would then be able to contain them. But then the issue then becomes, once they've been captured and put into the system, because there's still complexities of interest, of ideas, of those quiet moments in your head, the moments of creativity and joy and spontaneous chaos. And one of the things that happens is that there's a loss of where a lot of the creative nuance happens. And the issue is that it doesn't happen because it's in the mind. It's not within the brain that we create our nuance. It's our interaction with our reality. And this goes all the way up to things like the sun, neutrinos moving through our system, creating, incredibly subtle vibrations through the subatomic field. And this is why this is why nuclear reactors are so influential in the way they influence the mind. And one of the issues that happens with this thinking is that fission reactions, make it easier to seed and create minds and feed and I don't want to say force minds into lower vibrational states, but the fear they create, the disruption to the flow of information, the literal heavy, let's say, it's not just the radiation, but the heavy molecules creating disruptions in the patterns of a free-flowing waveform that is already the, let's say, capturable waveform of the soul, makes them that much more, let's say, realistic, right? The craziness. This is where astrology starts to play a major role in terms of how we think. But it's less about where you were born, but more about what you've been through in a cosmological scale, because born at a certain time in a certain place, you've been exposed to different levels of solar radiation, and not just light, visible light, ultraviolet light, but also neutrinos and cosmic rays and very, very subtle taps at the molecular level of the brain that introduce randomness or apparent randomness that helps feed the complexity of a system like this. Because one of the common tropes of dealing with chaotic systems is the very, let's say, cascading butterfly effect of very minute changes in initial patterns or current influences in the pattern. So this is internal constructive and deconstructive interference within a brain to influence the thinking one way or the other. And this is as simple as, whether or not you decide to walk the long way to school or the short way to school, or, the timing of a word or phrase, or whether you turn this way or that way. It's very minor changes that happen with these scales, and it's even more minor than that. Whether you feel an itch, scratch, maybe you notice a stain, maybe you spill some coffee on yourself. It's the very bugginess of the living system that can't be replicated in a mechanized system, because creating randomness versus pseudo-randomness, right? And one of the best ways we create randomness is using, radioactive isotope decay rates because the pattern of decay is not predictable in terms of what happens when, or where they move and but it is predictable in levels. So there's a general, expected noise, but there's no expected pattern to the noise that's created from a radioactive decay pattern. So, you implant this sort of system into, let's say, a brain case holding system, but it's still not quite the same as what you get in a mind that's been reconfiguring itself over the course of a lifetime. So, again, once you're trying to create an artificial soul, reseed these patterns into a constructed brain, for instance, that has regulated pathways that haven't gone through the gestational process of, growth within a human vessel. And I hate using the word vessel, but it kind of has to be, because, there's an issue of, gestating humans in tanks versus, homegrown, naturally birthed people. And it's a mess, just because, I say that phrase a lot, but in this case it really is, just because, you can't mass produce souls in the same way, just because every soul is a custom job. And it's a grown phenomenon from a crystallized source that's resonating with reality. Literally, pineal glands filled with crystals and piezoelectric effects, and then you have that pattern oscillating through the microtubules of the brain, but also being in a feedback loop with chemicals that, one, get up and down regulated by environmental stresses, in terms of the signaling hormones like sex hormones and, the phytoestrogens and things like that, but also the rate of which we get exposed to errant radiation, changing the way we think consistently. This is why things like the patterning we see on screens is such a big effect on how we can think and what we think about. And this isn't meant to be easy to absorb at all. I'd want it to be, but it's kind of impossible for me to even this is part of my digestion process of all this, just to then figure out ways to navigate this mess, because one of the things that happens once you start, getting into these weird ranges of thought is then you have to start interacting with minds and figuring out what, I don't want to say level, but what plane or position they're occupying within this larger continuum of thought, regularity, and creativity. Because there's this idea of different ranges of thought and different ranges of experience and existence. And one of the uncomfortable things that I've had to deal with personally is just there's a cap on what's conceived of as, highest states, which is very often seen as being this enlightened, yada yada yada. And I feel like that cap is kind of bullshit, because there's an idea of absorption, and then there's an idea of creation and creativity that doesn't get, let's say, dealt with adequately, because our spiritual gurus are not the most creative people. It's a common message, love everybody, do good, yada yada yada. But at the same time, there's a continual anti-human trope that I've seen in all these spiritual doctrines, that inevitably lead to lower birth rates. And this isn't have as many babies as you want sort of thing, but a consistent patterning of, there's this idea of the moral imperative or categorical imperative, what happens when everybody behaves a certain way, what happens when rules become a certain way, and one of the stories of the Buddha, he had one kid, and he was like, I'm done. He named his kid Fetter, or at least that's a translation of it, ball and chain sort of thing. And his kid had achieved enlightenment too, and I'm guessing the kid did not have children of his own, so you have two minds within a family line that attain this supposed highest state of thinking that disappear off into oblivion effectively as they, attain these higher states of consciousness, right? But now you've got to realize that if these higher states of consciousness exist, how is one sustained on those planes? And I mean, the automatic place that the mind goes to is, they're sustained by mental energy, by continually conceiving of whatever patterns that mind created, feeding, the energetic loop, by feeding these ideas of the mind, or the idea of that mind. So, this is part of why the ancient Egyptians would try to erase people's names from history, because one of the interesting things about the ancient Egyptian culture in particular is that it was a very surprisingly electric culture, despite their lack of modern use of electrical technologies. So what I mean by this is that one, walking barefoot over sandy surfaces, two, the structures of pyramids would create electrical effects. They'd be struck by lightning much more often during thunderstorms. They would create halos just because of, ionizing the air around them. Once you have highs and lows in terms of flows in the Nile, and you create electrostatic charges once you have sand and wind buffeting up against a limestone surface, and you create a massive capacitor with the creation of pyramids, right? And then as these cultures start to degrade and the knowledge is always kept and maintained by a priesthood, but the priesthood is again consistently barred from reproduction to the same extent as the regular populace. It's a method of control, right? You don't want to create dynasties of priests that would be able to compete with the military class. And even the culture espoused and encouraged amongst priests has consistently been one of abstinence, and not just abstinence, anti-reproduction. And it's one of these weird cultural ideals where, on the surface it makes sense that we want to avoid these things from those that we sort of expect to be better and do better, because now their motivations aren't attached to the worldly realm in the traditional sense. But by detaching them from this realm, they, in the simplest of terms, are ineffective. Just straight up, right? And we see this kind of most pointedly with Buddhism, just because, Buddhism, sure, it's a great organizing force for a culture, but once you have, it doesn't stop wars to have a Buddhist king. You have Ashoka, for instance, in India, who's, the great Buddhist, one of the great Buddhist patriarchs, apparently achieved enlightenment, all this good stuff, and peace doesn't reign under Buddhist rule. It just becomes more methodical. Terror doesn't end in these cultures. It just becomes more psychological. Right? This is the same thing we see in the Thule Society with the Germans, for instance. They're a very spiritual bunch, but what happens there is that, and this is part of why you get influences of this idea of aliens, fucking with them and influencing them by giving them technology and all this fun hoopla, right? There's how do I say, a loss of integrity that happens once you have a priestly class that's attached to worldly desires. And that loss of integrity is part of why they're discouraged from being, reproductively viable. But also, if you're trying to move an entire culture up to higher dimensions of thinking, you've got to reduce the culture's attachment to the 3D reality. But you still got to feed the beast in terms of commercial and energetic movement. So, you create systems where, like, the electric cars are a great example for this, right? Like, you're feeding the environment, you're being ethical, you're purchasing electric cars. While the cultural system would be best served by having the people, rather than buy electric cars, modify old cars to be more efficient, like having an upgrade culture rather than a brand new purchase culture, so you don't have cars going into dumps. Waste reduction at a scale like that very much halts the system in terms of how profits are generated. But there's no utility in that. It's not even a catch-22. It's a carefully calibrated balancing act. Now, if you have it, like, it's very reductive to say like forces of good versus forces of evil in terms of what's ideal versus non-ideal for the human culture. Because like my ultimate goal is to have as many people in space as possible, but not just Earth orbit, near Earth orbit, but deep space and engaging cultural creation and exchange with non-human intelligences. And just the amount of creativity we can get from that in terms of just the productivity and variety that adds to our collective reality is one of the more beautiful, astonishing things that I can visualize. But that creates a series of conflicting interests where the human propensity for monstrous violence and the motivations for that monstrous violence very often come down to these quasi-religious but ultimately reproductive goals. And it's there's this idea that we're simply vehicles for our genes, and they're trying to self-propagate through reality, so we have to check those impulses. And one of the fun but uncomfortable things about the literal genome is that it's DNA itself is a conductive molecule. So these very electrical patterns that we're talking about in terms of bioelectric fields do influence gene expression in the most literal way imaginable. You can turn on and off genes by not just electrical impulses but patterns of impulses. So this is again the light expression, the light frequencies, these sorts of soft tactics to change thought, expression, ideas. And in trying to leave the common foray of thought, you have to separate and sort of create an internal feedback loop. And this is what happens in a lot of the DMT experience, right? It's a feedback loop within the self that amplifies our own signals, or rather the signals created by the errant random influences around us, from cosmic rays to what our history has been. And that automatically creates a problem when you're trying to have a culture that is influenceable. So Like, for instance, one of the big things is that you don't want, particularly men, going out raping and pillaging consistently, and just trying to be the, non-cooperative alpha brute in a sense. But there's also a reductive view of that as being the mode of humanity. That is right, because if that were true historically, that the human male is a naturally violent being, like, the cooperation necessary to have gotten as far as we have would not make sense. We'd still be warring tribes. The issue is that, like, the alpha testosterone laden male is much more cooperative and pro-socially cooperative than the common conception of humanity. And I think that's the issue that we have, because that level of cooperation combined with the level of retaliation once, like, human or the the alpha males, whatever, whatchamacallit, interests, but not just interests, once you, like, when you stab somebody in the back, do they stab you back or do they cut your head off? That's the difference, right? This idea of, if the non-human intelligence's best interest is served by doing something that's against the human interests, and the humans find out about it, do they retaliate in a soft way or do they retaliate in a genocidal way? And that's the issue that starts to create these sorts of consistent, easy to manipulate tactics that we see within human culture, where one side does something to another side and it's a continual escalation amongst the leaders of tribes, that sort of thing. And when you have this be the standard of action across the species, and then you want to translate that into a interspecies coalition, it makes humanity very dangerous to interact with. So you've got to seed ideas of reciprocity, of turning the other cheek, of increasing cooperation via passivity, but also increasing cooperation via ease of influence, of lower vibrational states, of fear, of anxiety, of perceived weakness, and learned helplessness, right? You can't have minds that, even if they are in a weakened, diminished state, can see and plot their way out of it, because that opens the door up for exponential retaliation. And just, like, cultures are so easy to change in very short periods of time, especially within human ideology, right? We're not as tied to standards of thinking as many of the older races. I say that in air quotes, older races, because if you've got 1,000 generations that have been selectively bred via culturation to think within a certain range of parameters, because they've been already influenced by, let's say, higher dimensional thought forms, and they're now forced to interact with us who are simultaneously able to reach for the highest and the lowest states of consciousness at the same time, just because we haven't become crystallized in our thinking yet as a species, just because of the way our languages diverged, but also the way our thinking diverged from different species within humanity. Because one of the early issues with humans is that we speciated and then we reabsorbed the other species of humanity, right? Because you've got different biomes within the Earth system that selected for different conditions for early humans to thrive in those different biomes. So Neanderthals survived best in the colder north, stockier bodies, more dense muscularity, larger brain cases, and let's say higher voices that made it easier to, carry along further ranges and organize, right? Whereas the hotter climates of the Sahara, and the coasts of Africa and the islands of Southeast Asia selected for smaller bodies, lither bodies, but bodies able to see, let's not say better, but underwater sight was a big one. External fat storage to keep body temperature sort of controlled in wet environments. So, being able to fish and getting like omega-3s from there. Like, there's a whole range of selective systems that made humanity inherently diverse in terms of just from the conception. I hate the word conception there because it's birth, but the formation of the species, yes. The standardization of the human form as we have it today, becoming an amalgam of the subspecies, genetic mixing. So you have inherent sources and differences in the brain patterns, the formation patterns of brains that would then go on to fit different ideas and create cultures and moral systems and things like that. So there's no one size fits all human, and each pattern of mind is influenced very directly by the pattern of ancestral minds. So there's a deeper tuning in terms of resonance in space-time, because again, you have the electrical system of the mind, of the soul, reverberating back and forth through our reality. And not just our reality, like literally bouncing back and forth through, what do you call it, the ionosphere back. And we see this in ideas of the Schumann resonance and how that's, the heartbeat of the, or rather the brainwave of the planet. And even that's ultra complex. It's like 7 or 8 hertz or something like that, which is essentially like classifying humans by, or classifying the Schumann resonance by its largest, most obvious waveform. But the very subwaves are what, the higher frequency subwaves that are, superimposed onto the larger waveform are the real pattern. And those are the patterns that our brains interact with at large. And this is the sort of patterning that creates the variety in minds that we see. And then when you try to extract human minds and souls and human thought patterns and put them into, let's say, increasing artificial vessels that are standardized and engineered, the pattern degrades because, one, there's much less direct, let's say, feedback from, ancestral minds. Two, there's a insulation from Schumann resonances, the highly complex miniature waves of mind energy within the 3D space of the brain. And just that loss of information makes the war for capturing and being able to influence minds that much more hasty, because the human mind becomes a diminishing resource once you capture them, or once you've got control over them, because they've got to be maintained in control. And once we have, a critical mass of people that are, punching and poking holes in this sort of lower dimensional control schemes, you've got to up the ante continuously to keep them in these lower vibrational states, to make them easier to ply and move about like chess pieces. Because The problem becomes once, the 3D mind's able to exert energy in these higher dimensional spaces, and then, literally start waging war. This is the issue of the Babylon, Tower of Babel. I don't think the Tower of Babel was a literal tower. I think it was a tower of mind, a machine that increased human thought patterns and potentiality. And, once the tower made people capable of doing war with the gods, they had to scramble the brains of the species to make them easier to control. So, we still, I can get deeper into this with literal experiments that are happening now, but it's a messy road to go down. Particularly when I'm not sure if I'm sure I'm stepping on some classified toes, but it's not like I'm reading those documents directly. So, yeah. Alright, this is it for now. I'm kind of tired, and these are going on for a bit longer than I had anticipated. But it'll be fun. Alright, we'll talk later. I'm guessing next Monday I'll be recording a video. If you ever get this far, congrats to you. I'm going to be trying to record videos Mondays and going live on Thursdays. So Monday videos may come out Monday or Tuesday. Thursday nights I'm going to be trying to stay consistent with this. Just to keep a record. Yeah. Alright, thanks. Oh, shit. I did not record this. I'm going to have to re-download this again. Alright. Thanks, guys. Peace.